Who was George Washington, really? We've seen his face 1,000 times, carved in stone, printed on money, frozen in portraits that make him seem almost superhuman. But behind the myth, behind the marble, stood a man, ambitious, uncertain, and deeply human. A man who made mistakes, carried doubts, and constantly wrestled with the weight of destiny. This isn't the story of a flawless founding father. It's the story of a soldier who learned through failure, a leader who never sought power yet couldn't escape it, and a man whose private life reveals as much about America as his public triumphs. We'll uncover the hidden layers of Washington's life, the passions he concealed, the fears he overcame, and the choices that shaped not only his own future, but the future of an entire nation. So if you're ready to see the first president like never before, the man behind the legend, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us. Because we're about to begin the untold story of George Washington. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in the rolling fields of Westmoreland County, Virginia. A colony defined by rigid hierarchies and unspoken ambitions. He came into a world where wealth, power, and prestige were measured not by birthright alone, but by land, and by how close one stood to the British crown. His family belonged to what might be called the middling gentry, respected but far from elite. The Washingtons owned land and a few enslaved laborers, yet they were not among the great plantation dynasties that ruled Virginia society. From the beginning, George was aware of both privilege and limitation, close enough to the top to glimpse its comfort, but distant enough to feel the sting of exclusion. His father, Augustine Washington, was a stern but ambitious man who tried to secure his family's rise through hard work and careful management. When Augustine died suddenly in 1743, young George was just 11 years old. The death changed everything. The family estate was divided, and George, being one of the younger sons, inherited little compared to his half-brothers. His dream of studying in England, as many sons of wealthy Virginians did, vanished overnight. Instead of education in the metropole, he would learn from the rough soil of Virginia itself, through labor, observation, and his own determination. Deprived of formal schooling, Washington began to teach himself mathematics and geography. He studied land deeds and surveying manuals with obsessive precision. In colonial America, surveying was more than a trade. It was a path to knowledge, wealth, and status. The colonies were still largely wilderness, and the ability to measure and claim that wilderness for the crown or for settlers was a ticket to opportunity. Washington seized it with both hands. At just 16, he joined a surveying expedition into the vast and untamed Shenandoah Valley. The experience would mark him forever. For the first time, he left behind the structured, class-conscious world of the tidewater plantations and ventured into the raw frontier, a land of deep forests, treacherous rivers, and endless possibility. There, amid the silence of uncharted valleys, Washington discovered something that would stay with him throughout his life: the value of resilience and the power of self-reliance. Nights were spent under open skies, meals were sparse, and the dangers constant. Yet he thrived in that wild uncertainty. As he moved through the frontier, mapping boundaries and negotiating with settlers, Washington began to see land not only as a means of survival, but as the foundation of identity and legacy. To own land was to command respect. Each acre he surveyed symbolized potential. The potential to rise, to be recognized, to prove his worth in a world where birthright had denied him privilege. The wilderness, in a sense, became his first battlefield, one where he learned endurance, patience, and command over both environment and emotion. But colonial Virginia was not a place where ambition alone guaranteed advancement. Status was dictated by connections, by association with the British elite who controlled the colony's government and economy. Washington's half-brother Lawrence, who had served in the British military and married into the powerful Fairfax family, became George's link to that higher world. Through Lawrence, George was introduced to Lord Fairfax, one of the most influential men in Virginia. The meeting would prove pivotal. Fairfax saw in the tall, quiet young man a rare combination of discipline and hunger. He employed Washington to survey his extensive lands in the Shenandoah, giving the teenager a job that paid well, and more importantly, earned him visibility among the powerful. These early years carved Washington's worldview. He learned to read people as carefully as he read the land. He observed the manners and etiquette of Virginia as upper class and began to model himself after them, always aware that respectability was a performance as much as a virtue. Behind his reserved demeanor was an acute sensitivity to honor and perception, a desire to be seen as capable and dignified in a society that constantly reminded him of his lower rank. He also came to understand the contradictions of colonial life. He was a loyal subject of the British Crown, proud to serve under its flag, yet his experiences at the edges of empire revealed a different truth. The frontier showed him that survival depended not on privilege or pedigree, but on will. In the wilderness, titles meant nothing. What mattered was one's endurance, one's ability to adapt, to command, and to lead. It was there that Washington began to sense the quiet tension between authority and independence, a tension that would define not only his future, but the future of his country. By the time he returned from his surveying expeditions, Washington had changed. He was still young, but the softness of adolescence was gone. He had seen beyond the world of parlors and plantations into the vast and unpredictable continent that awaited conquest and order. He had also begun to collect land for himself, using the profits from his surveys to purchase small plots, a modest but significant step toward the power he longed for. Every map he drew, every mile he measured was a step towards self-creation. Washington was crafting more than a career. He was shaping an identity, one that blended ambition with restraint, calculation with courage. These qualities, formed in the silence of the Virginia wilderness, would one day define his command on battlefields and in the presidency. The boy who had lost his father and his inheritance had found something far greater: purpose. And though he could not yet see it, the restless young surveyor tracing the edges of a growing empire was already beginning to map the destiny of a nation. By the early 1750s, George Washington was no longer the curious boy who measured the wilderness. He was an ambitious young man searching for a place in the world. And in colonial Virginia, nothing offered prestige like the military. The British Empire was tightening its grip on North America, and conflict was brewing between Britain and France over control of the Ohio Valley, a vast contested territory stretching west of the Appalachian Mountains. The struggle for that frontier would ignite what history remembers as the French and Indian War. For Washington, it was the perfect stage to prove himself, to transform from land surveyor to soldier, from provincial gentleman to man of consequence. At just 21, he received a commission from Virginia's Lieutenant Governor, Robert Dinwiddie, to deliver a message to the French forces encroaching on British-claimed land. The mission was perilous, deep into hostile territory in the dead of winter, but Washington accepted it without hesitation. He traveled hundreds of miles through frozen wilderness, facing threats from both the elements and native tribes aligned with the French. Though the mission failed to change French policy, it succeeded in elevating Washington's reputation. His detailed journal of the journey, later published in both Virginia and London, portrayed him as brave, resourceful, and loyal to the British Crown. It was exactly the kind of recognition he had been yearning for. Encouraged by this attention, Washington sought greater military responsibility. Soon he was promoted to lieutenant colonel and sent back to the frontier with orders to secure British claims in the Ohio Valley. It was here that his hunger for glory met the brutal reality of war. In May 1754, his small force ambushed a French scouting party near what is now Pennsylvania, an attack that left several French soldiers dead, including their commander, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. The encounter, known as the Jumonville Affair, was Washington's first taste of combat, and his first major mistake. The French declared that the attack was murder. Washington insisted it was defense, but the truth was murky, and the incident helped spark a full-scale war between France and Britain. Realizing he had provoked something far beyond his control, Washington hastily built a crude defensive structure he called Fort Necessity. There, surrounded by rain-soaked earth and under constant threat of attack, he waited. The French soon retaliated, surrounding the fort with superior numbers. The battle was chaotic and short. After hours of fighting, Washington was forced to surrender, the only time he ever did so in his life. Worse still, The surrender document he signed, written in French, contained a confession that he had assassinated Jumonville, a claim he likely did not understand at the time. The humiliation was immense. The young officer who had sought glory instead found himself the unwilling author of an international scandal. When word reached Virginia, reactions were mixed. Some saw him as a brave soldier overwhelmed by impossible odds, others as an inexperienced provincial who had overstepped his station. Washington himself was devastated. The loss at Fort Necessity left a scar that would never fully fade. Yet in that defeat, something vital began to form, a deeper, colder understanding of leadership and responsibility. He learned that ambition without judgment could destroy as quickly as it could elevate. From then on, Washington began to master his impulses, to cloak emotion in discipline. The fiery young man who once rushed toward battle began to adopt the calm, deliberate demeanor that would define him in the years to come. He became acutely aware of how every action, every word, every gesture could shape his reputation. The experience hardened him, but it also taught him the language of command, patience, restraint, and the value of image. Despite the embarrassment, Washington's courage did not go unnoticed. When Britain sent General Edward Braddock to America in 1755 to lead a massive expedition against the French, Washington joined his staff as a volunteer aide-de-camp. He saw in Braddock's army the professionalism and order of the British military, everything the colonial militias lacked. Yet he also witnessed its arrogance. Braddock dismissed colonial officers as inferior and ignored warnings from frontiersmen about native tactics. Washington admired the discipline, but sensed the brittleness beneath it. The lesson came violently. As Braddock's column advanced through the Pennsylvania wilderness, they were ambushed by a force of French and Native American warriors. The battle turned into a massacre. Braddock was mortally wounded, and chaos erupted among the redcoats. Amid the slaughter, Washington emerged as one of the few officers to maintain composure. 2 horses were shot beneath him, and 4 bullets pierced his coat, yet he remained untouched, an almost mythic stroke of fortune that soldiers whispered about for years afterward. Washington organized the retreat, saving what remained of the army. It was a moment of redemption, proof that he could lead not through command from above, but through presence in the chaos. Still, for all his service, Washington found his ambitions limited by class and hierarchy. The British Army refused to grant him a regular commission, viewing colonial officers as lesser men. It was a bitter realization. No matter his courage or competence, he would never be seen as an equal. The rejection cut deep, feeding a quiet resentment that would over time evolve into something larger, a questioning of the very system he had once worshipped. By the war's end, Washington returned to Virginia older, wiser, and deeply changed. He had seen glory and humiliation, bravery and arrogance. He had learned that leadership was not about the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. Yet beneath his polished composure lingered a restless spirit, a man torn between loyalty to an empire that denied him and the dawning recognition that his destiny might lie elsewhere. The seeds of that conflict, between service and independence, between obedience and identity, had been planted in the smoke of Fort Necessity and the blood of Braddock's defeat, and soon those seeds would grow into revolution. When George Washington returned to Virginia after the French and Indian War, he was a changed man. No longer the inexperienced provincial who had sought glory in the wilderness, but a disciplined and ambitious figure determined to secure his place among Virginia's elite. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a soldier who had seen both triumph and humiliation and had learned to conceal emotion behind a mask of calm authority. Yet beneath that composed exterior, a deeper hunger persisted, the desire for recognition, stability, and the kind of respect that only wealth and land could command. In 1758, after years of service, Washington resigned his military commission. He had endured the frustrations of British hierarchy and the physical toll of years on the frontier. What he sought now was not adventure, but establishment, to build a life worthy of the status he believed he had earned. Fate soon provided an opportunity. Through social circles in Williamsburg, he met Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 children and one of the most desirable marriage prospects in Virginia. Martha was intelligent, gracious, and possessed a large estate inherited from her late husband, Daniel Parke Custis. Their marriage in January 1759 was both affectionate and strategic. Washington genuinely cared for Martha, but the union also transformed his social standing overnight. Through her dowry, he became one of the wealthiest landowners in the colony. The once modest surveyor was now the master of Mount Vernon, a grand estate overlooking the Potomac River, and custodian of the Custis fortune, which included vast land holdings and enslaved laborers. Mount Vernon became the stage upon which Washington would craft his public identity. He threw himself into the life of a planter with the same discipline he had once applied to military service. His days began before dawn, inspecting fields, reviewing ledgers, and writing meticulous letters to merchants in England. He experimented with crop rotation, soil management, and innovative farming techniques, determined to make his estate not just profitable, but exemplary. Tobacco, the lifeblood of Virginia's economy, had exhausted the soil, so Washington shifted toward wheat and diversified his operations. His efficiency and foresight turned Mount Vernon into a model of colonial enterprise. But the prosperity of Mount Vernon, like that of nearly every plantation in Virginia, was built upon the labor of enslaved people. Washington owned, through inheritance and marriage, dozens of men, women, and children whose forced labor sustained his wealth and reputation. The young master viewed slavery at first through the same pragmatic lens as his peers, a system of economic necessity, a reality so deeply embedded in colonial life that few questioned its morality. He considered himself a benevolent slaveholder, ensuring that his enslaved workers were fed and housed. Yet his records reveal a man who enforced discipline, pursued runaways, and treated human lives as assets on a balance sheet. Still, beneath that practicality, subtle cracks began to form. Washington's sense of order and fairness clashed, however faintly, with the brutal inequities of the system he upheld. He relied on the enslaved to maintain his rising status, yet his growing belief in merit and hard work could not fully reconcile with the fact that his own success was tied to bondage. These contradictions would deepen over time, but for now he buried them beneath the surface of duty and decorum. As his fortune grew, so too did his political influence. Washington served as a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, where he observed firsthand the widening tension between colonial interests and British authority. His experiences with imperial arrogance during the war had left a lingering resentment, and the new taxes and restrictions imposed by Parliament only sharpened that feeling. Yet he was not yet a revolutionary. Washington valued order and stability, and his loyalty to the crown remained sincere. But he also valued autonomy, the freedom to govern one's affairs without interference. That principle, born of his years as both soldier and planter, would soon place him on a collision course with empire. Life at Mount Vernon projected the image of domestic tranquility. Visitors described Washington as reserved but courteous, a man of few words and precise manners. Martha, warm and sociable, managed the household with quiet authority. Together they hosted neighbors, politicians, and travelers, embodying the refined grace of Virginia's gentry. Yet those who knew Washington well could sense a restlessness beneath his composed exterior. He was meticulous, almost obsessive about order, about the alignment of fences, the accounting of harvests, the exactness of correspondence. Perhaps it was the residue of military discipline, or perhaps it was the expression of a deeper need for control in a world that had often denied him it. Despite his wealth and growing prominence, Washington's ambitions were far from satisfied. He wanted not just to belong among Virginia's elite, but to define what that meant. He cultivated an image of honor, restraint, and integrity, careful never to appear boastful or reckless. Every decision, from the clothes he wore to the guests he entertained, was part of a deliberate effort to construct a legacy. He understood that reputation was power, and he guarded his with almost sacred precision. And yet, as the years passed, the boundaries of his world began to feel smaller. The same land that had once symbolized opportunity now seemed confining. The order he imposed on his estate could not quiet the growing unease he felt toward Britain's tightening control over the colonies. Washington's life had been built on loyalty to empire, but his success, his identity, and his vision of America were increasingly rooted in independence, in the belief that his destiny, and that of his fellow colonists, could not be dictated by distant rulers. In the quiet hills of Mount Vernon, amid the rhythms of planting and harvest, that belief began to take root. The soldier had become a statesman, the planter a symbol of colonial virtue. But beneath the polished surface of civility, something was stirring. A tension between wealth and principle, between the comfort of tradition and the call of change. Soon, the world beyond his fields would erupt in revolution, and the man who had sought only respect and security would be called to risk everything he had built in the name of freedom. By 1775, the colonies stood on the edge of transformation. The tension between Britain and America had grown from political quarrel to open rebellion, and the dream of reconciliation was fading fast. In the midst of this upheaval, George Washington, planter, veteran, and respected Virginian, found himself drawn into a conflict larger than any he had ever imagined. He was no radical firebrand, no eloquent agitator for independence, but a man of duty, deeply uneasy with chaos, yet unwilling to surrender liberty to tyranny. When the Continental Congress assembled in Philadelphia to organize a unified resistance, Washington arrived wearing his old military uniform, a silent signal that he was ready to serve, whatever the cost. In June of that year, Congress appointed him Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. The choice was strategic as much as symbolic. Washington's reputation for integrity, his experience in the French and Indian War, and his Virginian roots gave the northern colonies confidence that the South was committed to the cause. Yet Washington himself accepted the position with humility and unease. He knew the odds were nearly impossible. The colonies were untrained, underfunded, and divided. Britain was the most powerful empire on earth. "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with," he wrote, and he meant it, but duty had called, and he answered. When Washington arrived at Cambridge to take command, the reality before him was sobering. The so-called army was a collection of militias, undisciplined, poorly equipped, and prone to disobedience. Supplies were scarce, morale uncertain, and unity fragile. What Washington found was not a professional force, but a symbol, and it would be his task to turn that symbol into something capable of survival. His early months as commander were marked by relentless work. He imposed order through discipline and example, transforming chaos into structure. His presence alone seemed to command respect. Tall, dignified, and reserved, Washington spoke little but conveyed much. Soldiers learned quickly that beneath his calm exterior lay iron resolve. Yet no discipline could prepare the army for the realities of war. The siege of Boston in 1775 brought Washington his first test of leadership. He faced a formidable British garrison, fortified and well supplied, while his own troops lacked powder and weapons. For months, he maintained a tense stalemate, using patience as his greatest weapon. When cannons captured from Fort Ticonderoga were finally dragged across snow and ice to Boston, Washington seized the moment. Under cover of night, his men fortified Dorchester Heights, positioning artillery to threaten the city. The British, realizing their vulnerable position, evacuated Boston in March 1776. It was Washington's first victory, not through battle, but through strategy, endurance, and timing. The triumph, however, was fleeting. That summer, Britain struck back with overwhelming force. More than 30,000 British troops, the largest expeditionary army the empire had ever assembled, landed in New York. Washington's army, inexperienced and ill-prepared, was no match. The defeats came swiftly and brutally. Long Island, Harlem Heights, White Plains. Each loss was a reminder of the enormous gap between the Continental Army's aspirations and its abilities. Desertions multiplied, supplies dwindled, Congress criticized. Washington's command seemed on the verge of collapse. In those bleak months, the measure of Washington's leadership revealed itself not in victory, but in endurance. He refused to break, refused to lash out or surrender to despair. His letters from that period reveal a man of immense restraint, absorbing humiliation without showing weakness. He understood that his army's survival was the revolution's survival. Even in defeat, he preserved hope. His calm became contagious, his silence a form of strength. To his men, Washington became less a general and more a symbol, the embodiment of steadiness in a time of disarray. Then, as winter closed in and all seemed lost, Washington made a daring decision. On Christmas night, 1776, he led his army across the icy Delaware River to strike a surprise attack on the Hessian forces at Trenton. The victory was swift and stunning, followed days later by another success at Princeton. These moments did not change the course of the war militarily, but they transformed its spirit. Washington had turned despair into momentum, proving that courage and perseverance could defy empire. Still, the years that followed were grueling. Washington faced not only the British, but hunger, cold, and discontent within his own ranks. At Valley Forge in the winter of 1777–78, his army endured unimaginable suffering, disease, starvation, exposure. Many questioned whether the revolution could survive the season, yet Washington's presence never wavered. He visited the camps daily, sharing in the hardship, his calm authority holding the army together when everything else failed. Under the training of Baron von Steuben, the troops emerged from that winter transformed, hardened, disciplined, and ready to fight. Through it all, Washington's leadership was defined not by tactical genius, but by moral endurance. He was no Napoleon, no Alexander. He lost more battles than he won. But he understood something deeper, that the revolution was as much a test of will as of arms. His patience, his refusal to be provoked into rashness became his greatest weapon. He led not through passion, but through presence, commanding through example rather than rhetoric. His distance, often mistaken for coldness, was in truth a form of protection, for himself and for the cause. By the late 1770s, the Continental Army had become something extraordinary, not a force that could outmatch the British in power, but one that could outlast them in resolve. Washington's men revered him not because he was perfect, but because he endured what they endured. He shared their hunger, their fear, their exhaustion, and still stood tall. In the crucible of war, George Washington was remade. The ambitious young officer who once sought personal glory had become a leader defined by sacrifice and restraint. The chaos of revolution had tested every fiber of his being, and in that storm, he found his true purpose. His authority no longer came from titles or victories, but from something far rarer, the trust of those who followed him. That trust would soon be tested again, as the war dragged on and the dream of independence hung by a thread. But for now, through defeat and endurance, through silence and resolve, Washington had given the revolution its heart, and America its first vision of leadership. The winter of 1776 was more than a season. It was the crucible in which the American Revolution nearly froze to death. The dream of independence was collapsing under the weight of defeat. Washington's army, battered and starving, had dwindled to a few thousand exhausted men. Many soldiers' enlistments were about to expire, and few had any reason left to stay. Across the Delaware River, British and Hessian troops rested comfortably in New Jersey, confident that the rebellion was all but finished. Even Washington's allies in Congress were losing faith. The cause for liberty, so bold in words, so fragile in reality, seemed destined to die before it was ever truly born. But in the midst of despair, Washington saw opportunity. He understood that revolutions survive not only through strategy, but through spirit, and that the spirit of his army and of the nation itself hung by a thread. What he needed was not a grand victory, but a statement, a moment that could remind the world and his men that the fire of resistance still burned. And so on the night of December 25, 1776, while ice choked the Delaware River and a brutal storm lashed the valley, Washington made his move. The crossing of the Delaware was as audacious as it was desperate. In freezing darkness, the army ferried men, horses, and cannons across the river in small boats, fighting against wind, sleet, and deadly cold. Some soldiers marched barefoot, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. Washington, standing tall at the river's edge, urged them onward, not with speeches, but with presence. At dawn, they struck the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The attack was swift, the victory total. Hundreds of prisoners were taken, and the Continental Army had its first real triumph. A few days later, Washington struck again at Princeton, defeating another British force and retreating safely before they could retaliate. These victories, though modest in scale, changed everything. The Revolution's morale surged. Newspapers across the colonies hailed Washington as a hero touched by Providence, the leader who had resurrected a dying cause. To his soldiers, he became more than a commander. He was now the embodiment of endurance itself. Yet Washington knew how fragile that legend truly was. Behind the public praise lay a reality of exhaustion, disease, and discontent. Supplies were scarce, pay was late or non-existent, and many soldiers felt abandoned by the very government they fought to create. As the war dragged on, Washington faced challenges that had nothing to do with muskets or maneuvering. The Continental Congress, wary of centralized power, often questioned his authority. Ambitious officers schemed for recognition, and foreign advisors whispered criticisms of his cautious tactics. One such intrigue, known as the Conway Cabal, nearly cost him his command. Some in Congress believed Washington too hesitant, too slow to attack. They sought to replace him with General Horatio Gates, whose victory at Saratoga had made him the hero of the moment. But the plot collapsed when Washington, with quiet dignity, refused to engage in petty defense. His restraint, his refusal to descend into political squabbling, only enhanced his standing. This was Washington's truest genius, not on the battlefield, but in the realm of self-control. He understood the power of perception, the danger of emotion. Where others might have lashed out or sought revenge, Washington absorbed slights in silence. His discipline was not only military but moral. He grasped that in a revolution built on ideals, a leader must embody the stability that the cause itself lacked. His restraint became his weapon, his composure, his armor. Nowhere was that composure tested more severely than during the winter at Valley Forge in 1777-1778. There, Washington's army endured one of the darkest chapters of the war. Starvation, disease, and exposure claimed thousands of lives. The camp became a symbol of suffering, a frozen purgatory where the Revolution's faith was tested daily. Many soldiers lacked shoes, coats, or even blankets. Some ate their belts to stave off hunger. Desertion loomed, mutiny flickered, and hope seemed to drain with each passing day. Through it all, Washington stayed. He refused the comfort of headquarters far from the front, choosing instead to share in his army's misery. He walked among the tents, speaking softly to soldiers, encouraging them to endure just a little longer. Those who saw him in those months described a man physically worn yet spiritually unbreakable. His presence was the thread holding the army together. And slowly, with the arrival of foreign aid and the training discipline of Baron von Steuben, the ragged force at Valley Forge transformed into a true army. Out of suffering came strength, and out of hardship, unity. As spring arrived, the Continental Army emerged leaner, tougher, and more disciplined than ever before. Washington's leadership had not relied on grand victories or fiery rhetoric, but on endurance, on his unshakable belief that the revolution could outlast despair. His legend was no longer just about bravery or command. It was about patience, about the ability to stand still when the world demanded collapse. Yet Washington was not blind to his own humanity. In his private letters, he confessed moments of deep doubt. He feared that the cause might fail, that his sacrifices might mean nothing, that his name might be remembered not as a founder, but as a fool. These confessions reveal a man far more human than the marble icon of later generations, a man who felt fear, anger, and exhaustion, yet never allowed them to define him. His greatness lay not in the absence of weakness, but in his mastery over it. By 1778, the revolution was no longer just a military struggle. It had become a moral one. Washington's army represented endurance itself, a nation's refusal to surrender. He had turned defeat into defiance, suffering into strength. And though the war's end was still years away, the image of Washington, calm amid the storm, resolute in silence, had already become legend. That legend, however, came at a cost. Beneath the polished surface of honor and heroism, Washington bore the quiet burden of command, the loneliness of leadership, the weight of endless expectation. Yet it was precisely that burden, carried with such unflinching steadiness, that would make him not just the general of a revolution, but the moral compass of a new nation struggling to be born. By the early 1780s, after nearly 8 years of war, the dream of independence was finally taking shape, but at a cost so immense it defied measure. The fields of America were scarred, its economy in ruins, its people weary of sacrifice. And yet, against the might of the British Empire, George Washington's fragile army had endured. With the help of French allies and years of unrelenting perseverance, the tide had turned. The decisive blow came in 1781 at Yorktown, Virginia, where Washington's forces, in coordination with General Rochambeau and the French fleet, surrounded British General Cornwallis. When Cornwallis surrendered, the world witnessed the unimaginable, a collection of colonies defeating the most powerful nation on earth. Washington stood at the center of that victory, hailed as a hero across the continent. His name inspired reverence, even awe. But behind the celebrations, he was exhausted. The war had aged him. Gray streaked his hair, lines carved his face, and the weight of command had hollowed his expression. Yet even as he stood at the peak of glory, Washington's thoughts turned not to power, but to peace. He had seen too much of what ambition could destroy. He knew how revolutions often ended, with those who won them becoming the very tyrants they had fought against. And so, in an act that would echo through history, Washington chose to step away. In December 1783, he appeared before the Continental Congress in Annapolis, wearing his simple uniform, to resign his commission as Commander-in-Chief. The moment was solemn, almost sacred. The man who could have made himself king instead surrendered authority to the civilian government. His voice, steady but emotional, declared his intention to retire to private life at Mount Vernon. Members of Congress wept openly. Across the Atlantic, King George III reportedly remarked that if Washington truly gave up power, he would be the greatest man in the world. And in that moment, he was. Washington's resignation was more than humility. It was a deliberate act of symbolism. He understood the power of image, the way gesture could shape legacy. By stepping down voluntarily, he established a precedent that authority in America would be earned through service, not seized by force. It was an act of control, too, the final assertion of his will over the chaos that had defined his years of command. Having dedicated his life to the cause of liberty, he now reclaimed his own. Back at Mount Vernon, Washington yearned for peace. He turned once again to the rhythms of plantation life, the planting of wheat, the tending of fields, the correspondence that flowed from his study overlooking the Potomac. He wrote of contentment, of wanting only to sit under his own vine and fig tree. But even in retirement, the burdens of leadership followed him. The new nation he had fought to create was faltering. The Articles of Confederation, weak and ineffective, left the states divided and vulnerable. Debts went unpaid, trade stagnated, and discontent brewed among soldiers and citizens alike. Washington watched these developments with growing concern. He had hoped to live out his days as a private citizen, but his sense of duty would not let him ignore the nation's unraveling. The revolution had created independence, but not yet unity. By 1787, the call for stronger government had become impossible to ignore, and the aging general was drawn back into public life. When delegates gathered in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution, they turned to Washington to preside over the convention. His presence alone lent the gathering legitimacy. His reputation for integrity, the glue that held distrustful factions together. He spoke little during the debates, preferring to guide through silence and example, but his influence was profound. The Constitution that emerged bore the imprint of his ideals, balance, restraint, and faith in character over charisma. When the document was ratified, Americans looked naturally to him to lead the new government it created. Yet once again, Washington hesitated. He knew too well the loneliness of power, the scrutiny it invited, the endless burden it carried. And still, he understood that his country needed him. "I was summoned by my country," he wrote, "whose voice I can never hear but with veneration and love." In 1789, he accepted the call and became the first president of the United States. His inauguration in New York was not a moment of triumph, but of solemn duty. As he placed his hand on the Bible and took the oath, the world watched something unprecedented unfold. A man who had won a revolution, now willingly submitting to the laws of a republic. The presidency Washington inherited was an experiment with no blueprint. Every gesture, every decision would become precedent, and so he governed with the same careful balance that had defined his military career, cautious, deliberate, aware that every action would echo far beyond his lifetime. He surrounded himself with men of intellect and differing views, among them Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, knowing that debate was the engine of democracy. His leadership, as always, was defined less by brilliance than by character, a steady hand guiding a nation still learning to stand. Yet even as he took office, Washington remained haunted by the same paradox that had defined his life, the tension between power and restraint, ambition and virtue. He did not crave the presidency, but he accepted it as another act of service, another burden to bear for the sake of unity. The humility that had led him to surrender his sword in Annapolis now guided his approach to civil governance. He was once again the reluctant leader, the man who could have ruled but chose instead to serve. As the war hero became a head of state, the legend of Washington grew still greater. But beneath the marble image of the nation's father, the human truth endured. He was a man constantly measuring his own strength against his principles, forever striving to reconcile the will to lead with the wisdom to let go. And in that delicate balance, between command and surrender, between ambition and moderation, the foundation of the American presidency was born. The presidency of George Washington began with silence, a symbol of both reverence and uncertainty. When he took office in 1789, the United States was not yet a nation in the modern sense. It was an experiment, fragile, untested, and divided by geography, class, and ideology. Every step Washington took would define the office itself, and he knew it. The man who had led soldiers into battle now found himself leading a people through the far subtler conflicts of governance. The stakes were no less daunting. On his shoulders rested not just the authority of a president, but the very idea of what a republic could be. From the beginning, Washington approached his new role with the same disciplined caution that had guided him through war. He understood that everything he did, from the tone of his speeches to the titles used in correspondence, would become precedent. He refused to be called Your Excellency or Your Highness, rejecting the trappings of monarchy that had poisoned the old world. Mr. President, simple and unadorned, would suffice. To him, the power of example mattered more than the power of command. Building a government from nothing required both vision and restraint. The Constitution was a skeleton. Washington's task was to give it life. He surrounded himself with men of extraordinary talent and extraordinary disagreement. Alexander Hamilton, his energetic Secretary of the Treasury, believed in a strong central government and a robust national economy. Thomas Jefferson, his Secretary of State, championed states' rights and individual liberty, warning that concentrated power would corrupt the republic. Caught between them, Washington became the steady axis around which the nation's early debates revolved. Hamilton's financial program, including the assumption of state debts and the creation of a national bank, sparked fierce opposition. The plan promised stability, but also concentrated authority in the federal government, alarming those who had just fought a revolution against centralized control. Washington, cautious but pragmatic, sided with Hamilton. He saw that the new republic could not survive without credit, order, and confidence in its institutions. Yet the decision came at a cost. His choice fractured the political unity he had hoped to preserve, giving birth to America's first political factions, Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Washington despised this development. To him, parties represented the decay of civic virtue, the triumph of self-interest over the common good. He had imagined a nation governed by reason and unity, not rivalry. But human nature, as he knew from years of command, rarely obeyed ideals. As political tensions deepened, he found himself increasingly isolated, a symbol of unity presiding over a country already learning to divide itself. His letters from the 1790s reveal growing frustration and fatigue. The line between forbearance and weakness, he wrote, is scarcely discernible. Even foreign affairs tested his delicate balance. When war erupted between Britain and revolutionary France, the young republic faced immense pressure to choose sides. Many Americans, inspired by France's revolution, demanded support for their former ally. Others, wary of chaos abroad, urged neutrality. Washington saw the danger clearly. If America aligned too closely with either side, it could be dragged into another devastating conflict. In 1793, he issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, insisting that the United States must remain impartial. The decision enraged both factions. Jeffersonians accused him of betraying liberty. Federalists demanded closer ties with Britain. But Washington stood firm, believing that independence required the courage to remain apart. Through these storms, Washington maintained the outward calm that had defined his character since the Revolution. But beneath that composure, he was weary. The presidency, far from a crown of glory, had become a burden of isolation. He rose before dawn, worked late into the night, and spent most days in silence or careful deliberation. Friends who visited the presidential mansion described a man growing older by the month, his expression grave, his health faltering. The same self-discipline that had made him great also imprisoned him, a life ruled by duty, not desire. Criticism weighed heavily on him. The press, once reverent, grew vicious as partisan newspapers multiplied. He was accused of monarchism, corruption, even senility. For a man who valued honor above all else, such attacks cut deep. Washington, who had never sought power for its own sake, now found himself vilified by the very people he had served. "I had rather be on my farm," he confided, "than be emperor of the world." Yet he endured, not because he loved politics, but because he feared what might happen if he left too soon. The Union was still young, still fragile. His presence alone held it together. By the time he entered his second term, the weight of leadership was visibly eroding him. His once fiery eyes had dimmed. His once towering energy had turned to quiet fatigue. But even in his exhaustion, he remained vigilant. He warned his cabinet and Congress alike that factionalism and foreign entanglements could destroy the republic from within. His farewell address, drafted with the help of Hamilton, became both a warning and a legacy. He urged Americans to value unity above all, to distrust the corrosive spirit of party, and to resist the allure of perpetual alliances. It was not a plea for perfection, but for endurance, the same principle that had guided him through war. When Washington finally decided to step down in 1797, it was another act of restraint that stunned the world. No president had ever voluntarily relinquished power, because no republic had lasted long enough for one to do so. In that single gesture, he reaffirmed his belief that leadership was service, not possession. The man who had twice laid down power, once as general, now as president, became the living embodiment of the ideal he had fought for. But as he left the capital for the last time, a quiet question lingered in his mind. Had he done enough? Could this fragile nation endure without him? He did not know. All he knew was that he had given everything, his strength, his youth, his peace, to a republic that was still finding its identity. And though he left office weary and uncertain, he also left it with faith, not in perfection but in possibility, the belief that the nation, like the man himself, could rise again and again from its doubts, held together by character, restraint, and an unyielding sense of duty. When George Washington left the presidency in 1797, the applause of a grateful nation followed him home. Yet the sound that lingered longest was silence. After decades of command and public duty, Mount Vernon stood as both sanctuary and mirror. There, among the rolling fields and the steady rhythm of the Potomac, the man who had shaped a nation began to face the one battle no general could avoid, the reckoning with himself. He was 65, worn by years of service and the weight of expectation. His farewell address, published months earlier, had not been a farewell to life, but to public power, a parting lesson to the republic he had nurtured. In it, Washington had distilled a lifetime of experience into a simple truth: that unity was the nation's greatest strength and division its greatest peril. He warned against the baneful effects of the spirit of party, and against foreign entanglements that could corrupt independence. Yet beyond the political wisdom, there was a tone of quiet melancholy, the voice of a man who had seen too much of human frailty to believe in perfection, but still enough of human courage to believe in hope. At Mount Vernon, Washington tried to become once again what he had once longed to be, a farmer. He rose before dawn to oversee his lands, writing in his journal about crop rotations, weather patterns, and the constant struggle against debt. But the plantation was no longer the same as the one he had inherited decades earlier, and neither was he. The revolution had changed him, and so had the presidency. He had seen freedom not as an abstract ideal, but as a fragile living thing, easily betrayed by power and complacency, and nowhere did that contradiction weigh heavier than in the matter of slavery. Washington had been born into a world that saw human bondage as an unquestioned institution. As a young man, he had accepted it as natural, even necessary. The wealth that sustained Mount Vernon, and his own social standing, was built on the labor of the enslaved. Yet as he aged, the dissonance between his ideals and his reality became harder to ignore. During the Revolution, he had fought for the liberty of a people, while commanding an army in which free black men served with distinction. In office, he had signed laws that, while maintaining slavery where it existed, cautiously limited its spread. Privately, he grew increasingly uneasy. Letters from his later years reveal a man wrestling with conscience. He wrote to friends that he wished to see some plan adopted by which slavery in this country may be abolished by slow, sure, and imperceptible degrees. But Washington was also a man of his time. Cautious, pragmatic, unwilling to ignite the political explosion that such a stand would bring while the Republic was still fragile. At Mount Vernon, however, his actions began to speak where his words could not. He stopped buying enslaved people and refused to break apart families through sale or transfer. He quietly arranged in his will for all the individuals he owned outright to be freed after the death of his wife, Martha. It was a private decision, not a public declaration, yet in its quietness lay its power. Washington became the only founding father to emancipate his enslaved workers in his will, a final act of moral reconciliation between the principles he had preached and the life he had lived. In his last years, Washington's correspondence turned contemplative. He wrote with the tone of a man aware that time was no longer an ally. He had seen the birth of a nation, but not yet its adolescence. Political factions had deepened despite his warnings. The press still slandered him, though he no longer cared. The ideals of the revolution, unity, virtue, self-restraint, seemed to him increasingly fragile in a world drawn toward ambition and division. Yet even in disappointment, Washington held faith in the possibility of renewal. His religion was not one of ceremony, but of quiet morality, a belief that the measure of a person and of a nation lay not in power but in character. Visitors to Mount Vernon often found him walking the grounds in reflective silence. He spoke of the past sparingly and of the future with cautious hope. His body, once vigorous, had begun to fail him. His movements were slower, his breath shorter, but his mind remained clear. In conversations, he returned often to the themes that had guided his life: discipline, duty, moderation. Those close to him sensed that he was already preparing for the end, not with fear, but with the calm of a man who had spent his life mastering restraint. In December 1799, while inspecting his property during a cold rain, Washington caught a throat infection. Within days, his condition worsened. As physicians attempted primitive treatments, bloodletting, purging, and more, he faced death with the same composure he had shown in life. Struggling to breathe, he whispered, "I die hard, but I am not afraid to go." His final concern was for order. He asked that his papers be arranged properly, his affairs in order. Just before midnight on December 14, 1799, George Washington, soldier, president, farmer, took his last breath. The news spread with a grief that transcended politics. Bells tolled across the new republic. People wept openly in the streets. To the world, his death marked the end of an era. To America, it marked something more: the passing of the man who had taught a nation what leadership could mean. Even in death, Washington's restraint defined him. He left behind no heirs, no dynasties, no monuments of conquest, only an example. In his will, alongside the provisions for emancipation, he left instructions for his estate to be preserved, not as a symbol of wealth, but as a model of virtue and industry. His legacy, he hoped, would not rest in marble or myth, but in the daily practice of integrity. "I have no wish," he once wrote, "which aspires beyond the humble and happy lot of living and dying a private citizen." And yet, in that humility lay his immortality. Washington's final years revealed not a hero untouched by contradiction, but a man willing to confront it. He had begun life seeking honor and ended it seeking peace. In that quiet transformation, from ambition to conscience, from command to release, he gave the new nation its most enduring gift, the reminder that true greatness is not found in power, but in the courage to let it go. George Washington's final days were marked by the same calm and composure that had defined his life. In early December 1799, a bitter cold descended upon Mount Vernon, and Washington, ever diligent in overseeing his estate, ventured out into the rain to inspect his lands. That simple act, routine in life, proved fateful. He developed a severe throat infection, likely acute epiglottitis or quinsy, a condition untreatable with the medical knowledge of the time. Within hours, his condition deteriorated rapidly. Physicians attempted the standard remedies of the era, bloodletting, purges, and emetics, but their interventions only weakened him further. He lay in bed, conscious and composed, issuing instructions for the management of his estate and the welfare of his family. He faced mortality with the quiet acceptance that had guided him through war, revolution, and presidency. On the night of December 14, 1799, George Washington passed away, leaving behind a nation forever changed by his presence. News of his death spread like wildfire. Bells tolled from the northern colonies to the southern plantations. Citizens and soldiers wept openly in streets and churches. Washington's passing was mourned across the Atlantic as well, with European observers noting that the man who had led a rebellion against the most powerful empire in the world had died as quietly as he had lived. Yet, even in grief, the transformation from man to symbol began almost immediately. Stories of his courage, integrity, and restraint were polished and repeated, while the uncertainties, doubts, and contradictions that had marked his life were often glossed over. The image of Washington as the infallible father of the nation took hold quickly. Monuments rose, portraits were commissioned, and his likeness appeared on coins and currency. Biographies beginning in the early 19th century emphasized his virtues and heroism, crafting a narrative in which moral perfection seemed inseparable from military and political success. In these retellings, the complexities of his personality, his impatience, his occasional vanity, his initial complicity in slavery, were downplayed or omitted entirely. He became a mirror not just of his era, but of the ideals Americans hoped to project onto their young nation: courage, self-sacrifice, and unity above self-interest. Yet beneath the myth, the reality remained. Washington was profoundly human. He had been ambitious, sometimes frustrated, occasionally vain, and deeply conflicted about the moral compromises he inherited and upheld. He wrestled with fear, doubt, and the burden of leadership in ways that no monument could capture. His decisions were often shaped as much by pragmatism as by principle. He was a man who had understood the limits of human power, who had wielded authority with restraint precisely because he knew how dangerous it could be. His greatness lay not in perfection, but in the conscious effort to balance strength, morality, and duty under conditions few could endure. The duality of Washington's legacy has continued to provoke reflection across centuries. To some, he is the eternal hero, the unifying force who led a fledgling nation to independence, established the principles of republican governance, and voluntarily relinquished power when he could have seized it. To others, he is a symbol of the contradictions at the heart of early America, a revolutionary who owned enslaved people, a proponent of liberty who lived within a system of inequality, a man who preached unity yet presided over a nation grappling with division. The tension between these aspects of his life invites a deeper understanding of history, one that resists simplification and honors complexity. Historians and citizens alike have wrestled with these contradictions. Was Washington primarily a visionary or a product of his circumstances? Could he have done more to challenge slavery, or was he constrained by the fragile political and social realities of his time? Each generation reinterprets him, using his life as a lens through which to examine its own values, its own aspirations, and its own failures. In this way, Washington remains alive, not only as a figure of the past, but as a conversation with the present, a mirror of American ideals, tensions, and contradictions. As the story of George Washington closes, we are left with more than the memory of victories and political firsts. We are left with the image of a man who embodied endurance, discipline, and conscience, yet was never untouched by fear, ambition, or doubt. His life reminds us that leadership is as much about restraint as action, that greatness is forged not in perfection, but in the continuous negotiation between ideals and reality. In reflecting on Washington, we are invited to consider not just the man, but the nation he helped create. The revolutionary hero and the flawed human coexist, intertwined in the narrative of America itself. His story challenges us to confront the tension between aspiration and imperfection, between principle and compromise, a tension that remains central to the American experiment. In the end, understanding George Washington fully requires seeing him as he was, a man of courage and conscience, brilliance, and contradiction, who continues to illuminate the ongoing struggle to live up to the ideals he helped set in motion.